So Charlie prided himself on taking care of his body. He was disciplined and he was focused. He carefully watched everything he put in his mouth. He followed a strict diet. One evening, while reading a book, he became very, very hungry. He went to the kitchen just to look around. Inside the refrigerator and on the cabinet, but on the counter, he spotted a tin of chocolate chip cookies. His parents brought them over for the kids 2 nights ago as a gift. Charlie thought, one cookie couldn't hurt. In utter bliss, with all but one cookie left, he looked down soon and realized he'd eaten the entire batch. He said he could just sense the fat gather around his midsection. Feeling lousy about himself, he went to bed. When he got up the next morning, he thought, what the heck? I've ruined my good eating habits. I might as well have a bowl of these Fruit Loops, this donut, and that Danish over there. Then he remembered the words spoken by his rabbi. A righteous person falls 7 times and rises again. This is Proverbs 4:16. I hope you took note of what the rabbi said in this story shared by Maxine Dunham. The scripture in Proverbs states that a righteous, that is, a conscientious, an ethical, a virtuous person falls 7 times and rises again, over and over again. The verse did not imply that if a person falls, that's not true, for every person will fall, will make mistakes. The focus is less about falling and more about the rising again and again. I love this verse. It speaks so well to the fact that you and I, all of us, are human. I love the verse, and frankly, I hate the idea that I am prone to making mistakes. And yet, that's the gift of being human, because we learn from our mistakes. It has to do with the power, however, of humility, forgiveness, and about welcoming a renewed opportunity to rise again, to have a second chance. Many faith traditions speak to the ways we absolve ourselves when we fall short of our highest aspirations. That is, our best attempt to be kind, loving beings who don't make mistakes. But the fact is, we will make mistakes. A mistake is often referred to as a sin in the Jewish and Christian traditions. I know in our UU circles, we don't like to talk about the word sin. It's derived, however, from the sport of archery. It relates to aiming at a mark and missing it. Have you ever played darts? It can be a dangerous game, right? Especially if you're not mindful. That is thoughtful. In the same way, developing and maintaining relationships requires a great deal of care. To forgive, to ask for forgiveness, that's so much vulnerability. To surrender, to sometimes succumb to tears, frustration, and fears. You and I will fail over and over again, and in our trying, we will keep trying. In the falling and the failing, the best approach is to do so with humility. Again, embrace the fact that I am human, that you are human, and if we shy away from making mistakes, we won't grow, we won't continue to foster relationships. In 1,000 ways, we are an imperfect species, and guess what? We are surrounded by countless people who also make mistakes and who may or may not forgive. Some faults are huge and seemingly intentional. Others are small and unintentional. Maya Angelou wrote, I think we must surrender to the despair of unexpected cruelties and extend the wonder of unexpected kindness to ourselves and to each other. We deserve each other and each other's generosity. She continued, let the brain go to work. Let it meet the heart, and you will be able to forgive. Forgiveness involves deciding to open a clenched fist and to let go in order to begin again. There are countless ways to hit the reset button on a strained relationship. I know, sometimes it's really difficult. I have always loved the Jewish ritual of tashlik. It involves reaching inside one's pocket and symbolically letting go of transgressions into a moving body of water. It's performed during the days of awe, the high holy days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And this year, that's October the 2nd, by the way. You can do this anytime. On the one hand, privately, I have carried grudges like pebbles for years. I could stand by the water for days and not get my hand out of my pocket and not let go of hurtful things that have been done to me. And to make it worse, because I found myself unable to forgive at times, that guilt, that shame of my inability to forgive sits there too. On the other hand, I have experienced the power of reflecting on what it means to forgive, how one can benefit by saying, imagine how much better I could feel if I no longer carried this resentment. Just focusing on what it might mean to forgive or to let go is an essential element of fostering a life of well-being. I am in awe of people who can genuinely, readily express forgiveness. There's a story, it's a true story, about Hubert Humphrey, a former vice president. He died. Hundreds of people came across the world to come to his funeral. All were welcome except one person, former President Richard Nixon, who had not long previously dragged himself and our country through the humiliation and shame of Watergate. As people gathered and eyes turned away and conversations went dry around him, Nixon could feel the ostracism being laid out to him. Then, the story goes, Jimmy Carter, the serving U.S. president, walked into the room. As most of us recall, Carter was from a different political persuasion than Nixon, and Carter was and currently is well regarded for his honesty and his integrity. Do you know what he did? As President Carter moved to a seat, he noticed Nixon standing all alone. Carter immediately changed course, walked over to Nixon, held out his hand, smiling genuinely and broadly, embraced Nixon and said, "Welcome home, Mr. President, welcome home." That incident was reported in Newsweek magazine, by the way, and it included a quote. If there was a turning point in Nixon's long ordeal in the wilderness, it was that moment and that gesture of love and compassion. Dear ones, life is a journey through a vast hinterland. Sometimes we will find a well-lit path where we can skip merrily along. Other times we will find ourselves stumbling on a path, mired in confusion and, metaphorically speaking, falling into a field of fresh cow manure, whereby we emerge smelling like unbecoming stuff to our minds and bodies. No one likes moving through life covered in muck. The journey is tough when one is laden with shame or guilt for something one has or has not done, or to move with ease when one is encumbered with anger and rage and spite and frustration. Forgiveness is part of building trust. Trust in oneself and building trust in others. So when it comes to building trust, this is the second of a two-part sermon series. When it comes to building trust, there are three things. Recognize when a subtle act of exclusion occurs. I talked about this book last week. I'm bringing it up again because I believe in order to continue to build trust and to keep trying again to have relationships, we need to recognize when someone has said something, or ourselves, we've said something or done that makes somebody feel less than whole. Two, to become willing to address it in a kind or compassionate way. If you hear somebody else saying something that you recognize is hurtful to somebody else, if you point it out, do so in a kind, compassionate manner. And third, try again to foster and build relationships of trust. When we are able to do this, our UU gathering spaces become true universities of thought and awareness, leading to personal and societal transformation. Let me remind you, this morning's message relates to addressing subtle acts of exclusion. Those little actions or words that make people feel invisible, not normal, like they are bad people, like they are a threat to the status quo. I know some people can say, I think we should be focusing on the really big stuff like systemic racism and not little things like microaggressions or subtle acts of exclusion. So the authors of this book that I introduced earlier, Tiffany Jana and Michael Baran, responded in this way. When it comes to barriers to equity and inclusion, there are many threats. Some are structural, those need to be addressed through policy, change, and laws. And then others cause exclusion on a daily basis and can be addressed right away through interpersonal interactions. While some of the things people say and do are explicit and obviously racist, sexist, homophobic, and so on, most are much more subtle. But they're causing harm nevertheless, say the authors. That's why we need to address them now, as well as advocate for systemic change for more equity. So going back to catching a subtle act of exclusion, when you witness one, you have choices. When somebody is in front of you has told a joke that might make somebody feel less than whole or excluded, you can be silent, you can speak up, or you can gossip about it with others later. Authors Janet and Baran say you can help the initiator, quote, and the subject by naming the problematic behavior. Calling out a subtle act of exclusion is the best way to foster an inclusive environment in which microaggressions are not welcomed. When confronting the initiator, the person who told the joke or said something that was hurtful, do so with grace. I'm not a big fan of cancel culture. I know that's our initial reaction, but I think grace needs to be present always. Let them know what they said or did and why you perceived it as problematic. Then listen and wait for a response. If they're not showing signs of upset, feel free to proceed with helping them see the perspective of that subtle act of exclusion. If they're showing signs of distress or defensiveness, offer to see if they'll talk to you at a later time in a relaxed setting. Give them time to process what you've said. If a person is ridiculed loudly and without care, either the initiator would become so incensed that they won't pause to understand the impact of their actions. Certainly, they may be so upset they won't make any chances for connection again. Sometimes we stumble on our words because we're trying to be connected to another person, and it's those times that sometimes we end up hurting someone when in actuality we were wanting a connection. So the terms oops and ouch come to mind. They're very handy. If you are the one who experienced a subtle act, word, or behavior, say ouch. When the person says, excuse me, say what you heard, name it, explain it, and wait. When possible, explain how you felt. You said this is not as helpful as, it really hurt my feelings when I heard these words. If you are the person who said the hurtful words, say, oops, I see what I did. I can do better. Let me rephrase that. Then you can ask, am I getting it? Have I understood the point you made? I'm sorry, I made a mistake. If you are the initiator, forgive yourself and make a silent agreement with yourself to keep trying. Don't just close down and refuse to interact with others who are different. Don't stop trying. Oops and ouch. I know this might sound elementary or juvenile, but it puts a pause in an interaction to address those moments when we're causing or experiencing harmful words. It's important to stop and address it in order to nurture growth. Tiffany, Jana, and Michael Baran said, if we are not here to help grow each other in loving, honest relationships, then why are we here? Okay, humor is often a good way to soften an exchange. For example, many years ago, I was a UU coming in. I wasn't in the path to ministry yet. I was in a worship associate meeting, and the meeting was over, and a friend, one of the other associates, was walking behind me. We had known each other for quite some time, and we opened the door and started walking down the steps. She said, I just don't get people who say they are bisexual. Either a person is gay or a person is straight. I immediately stopped. Of course, she bumped into me, and we almost fell off the steps, but I yelled, ouch! She bumped into me, nearly fell off the steps. We grabbed each other. We ended up giggling. Then I said, you don't have to understand bisexuality. Only I do, and others like me. But you can at least respect who I am. RESPECT. Use humor. That helps. So the authors of the book I've been talking about for 2 weeks now shared another instance when a woman who was deaf boarded a plane. When Hannah, this woman, travels, her ticket will say deaf on it so that the attendants know that in case of emergency, they come tap her shoulder so they can help provide information for her. One time on a work trip, as people were boarding the plane, the flight attendant handed the deaf woman an emergency instruction card. It was in Braille. Think about that, the author said. What kind of subtle action was happening here? The flight attendant was implicitly communicating, you're invisible. Hannah, the woman who received the card in Braille, stood up, looked the attendant in the face, had that card, rubbed her ear with it, and said, this doesn't work. I hope the flight attendant apologized and made a mental note to be more careful in the future. I hope she forgave herself and didn't shy away in complete embarrassment for days, saying she will never try to interact again. I do not believe you and I were created to roam this earth as an angst-ridden species. Additionally, I acknowledge that the idea of considering forgiveness is a difficult concept for some of us. With all that's going wrong today, racism, political treachery, climate change, denial, etc., to discuss forgiveness seems a huge request, regardless of indiscretion of a major or a minor form. I get that. When I've spoken about forgiveness in the past, people have said, how can you ask or make such an appeal for forgiveness when faults are so audaciously evil? I know. To even discuss forgiveness in these times might be considered inconceivable. And yet, let me make two things perfectly clear. To forgive does not mean you must forget. My interest today is twofold. I want to encourage contemplation of what it might mean to offer amnesty, that is, to forgive yourself and others, and to encourage kindness when addressing subtle acts of exclusion. Incorporate the ability to listen and to remain humble. Remain humble in the process of seeking understanding. May we be encouraged to try again, and to learn from our mistakes. And especially allow someone else the opportunity to have a second chance at change of behavior, change of perspective. This is my focus. And second, in this time of very upsetting actions, it would be pompous and ingenuous act for me and anyone else to tell people they must forgive others. For example, in an article in Thought magazine titled "Why America Needs to Stop Asking Black People to Forgive Racism" by Kovi Biakolo writes, quote, "Black people are expected to forgive, and not just to forgive, but to forget. Forget and forget about slavery. Forgive and forget Jim Crow laws. Forgive and forget the institutional racism that was created and still persists. So no, No. Regardless of whether one forgives or not, one is not being asked to forget, and we certainly wouldn't ask this of people who have been so audaciously slandered, slaughtered, brutalized. The hope is that by never forgetting, one may move into the future thoroughly committed to wholeness and to rising again and to doing better, striving to do better, and maybe looking around and pulling others in the direction of wholeness and seeking to do better. There are countless reasons to remain upset about something you or someone else has done. I'm not here to argue this fact. Today, I am inviting you on a journey of deeper understanding. I'm asking you to commit to being open to learning new ways to offer kindness and respect by addressing the many subtle, hurtful ways we treat one another, and then encouraging one another to keep trying to connect and love one another in deeply authentic ways. May it be so.